Hello everyone to this recording of our open session, Sports Psych Mapping open sessions that we conducted between February and April 2021, leading up to our April, the first English edition, April 21, of our Introduction to Sports Psych Mapping course. My name is Alexander and I'm talking on behalf of me and my colleague Edward. I'm an Associate Professor, University of Suffolk. Edward is the lead psychologist of a 12-man psychologists team at Villarreal Football Club. And together we have elaborated sports psych mapping, also together with Lucy, who is the third co-author of our paper published about sports psych mapping. But Edward and I, we organized the CPD course in English and Spanish at the University of Suffolk, teaching or at least introducing to colleagues this interview framework called sports psych mapping. Over 4 open sessions, it was over 300 people have contacted or have registered. We have been talking to people from all over the world, which was really exciting. So we had people from as far as I'm in Spain right now, even though I'm working in the UK, it was in Spain as well. We talked with people from India to South America, which was really exciting. This circle of open sessions is over, so now we decided to make a recording for any of you who missed that session or who just want to watch it again or pass it on to colleagues who might be interested. The whole thing, the whole sports psych mapping thing started when we reflected on the content of sport and exercise psychology, of all those concepts that float in a sports psychologist's mind, and they're important to to help our athletes or coaches or our clients generally in their performance. So from social uh, aspects to metacognition to injuries to concentration skills, resilience, to our athletes' goals, aims, motivation, mental health, motivational styles, other life activities, dual careers, peer support, coaching, relationships, and so on. All those concepts were important. And we asked ourselves, can we somehow simplify the structure so that it's easier for an applied sport and exercise psychologist or performance psychologist to keep an overview of our client's psychological reality. And we came up with a relatively simple structure, which is called the knowledge map, which has 3 key components. There are 7 main components. You can see them on this slide, but 3 key components that summarize important variables related to athletes or clients' psychological reality. So that's external factors, the world around us, the spontaneous self, who we are, and then our mental skills, which contains the ability we have to change who we are to adapt to the external factors in our environment. And then, of course, you have things like perception, appraisal, and attention, which explain how the external world affects the spontaneous self. You have self-awareness, which explains how specific aspects of spontaneous self trigger the use of mental skills. You have self-control, which summarizes the effects of mental skills on the spontaneous self. And then you have performance, which is in part performance, but also social behavior, for example, which are reflections of our spontaneous self on external variables. And that's the underlying framework for sports psych mapping. Sports psych mapping then is an interview framework that is based on a holistic representation of everything that's important for sport, exercise, and performance psychology. In essence, sports psych mapping is a set of steps to conduct an exploratory interview. There are some important and interesting facts about it, but in its essence, what we publish is suggestions, steps, questions, topics to be asked so that we can explore a client's psychological reality, including external factors, what we call biopsychological descriptors. That's the spontaneous self, so who they are and how they are, and their psychological skills. But sports psych mapping is more than that. Of course, it's specific questions. We proposed them. They're in the article that is going to be published. It's accepted for publication. At one point, it's going to be published in the Sports Psychologist. We proposed those questions, but rather as a starting point. So when you don't know how to use sports psych mapping, you have concrete questions you can ask to your clients until you develop your own questions or your own version of the questions, your own style. Of course, sports psych mapping, as I said, these specific questions are based on a theoretical and comprehensive selection of topics, from external variables to who we are and how we are, to our psychological skills. But both the questions and the theoretical framework itself, they are suggestions that need to be adapted to practitioners' personal style and the needs of their clients. Although you will start possibly the first times you're going to use sports psych mapping, well, my recommendation is follow our guidelines. They're not perfect for you, but they're good for you. Perfect is what you're going to do with time, and that's the adaptation of all the questions, the topics, the style of asking, to your personal preferences and the needs of the clients you work with. There are two things, however, that makes sports psych mapping special, at least in our view. First of all, it's the interview is conceived as a tangible task. Instead of discussing the relationship of interviewer and interviewee as a as like almost like bipolar spectrum, where you can be more practitioner focused or more client oriented, we conceive sports psych mapping more in the theoretical framework of the pedagogical triangle, where you have the client, the learner, the person who develops. You have an agent who helps that person develop. In school, that's teacher. In our settings, well, that's the performance psychologist, sport and exercise psychologist. It could also be the coach. And then both, the person who wants to develop and the person who helps developing, interact together collaboratively with a task designed to help the first one to develop, and that helps the second one do their job in helping the first one to develop. So the task itself is designed, or the interview is designed as a task, and it's tangible. You have seen in the first slide a couple of cards. The questions come on cards, especially when we do face-to-face interviewing, which with the pandemic has become difficult. But initially we did a lot of face-to-face interviewing. We print out those questions on cards, we plastify them, and we can hand over the questions to our clients. They can actually touch them. And in my experience, at least, and I think Edu agrees completely, when you see how a client reacts when they actually gain control over the questions they're going to be asked in an interview, that's very that's very positive. That's very the control they perceive is something they appreciate a lot. And the second hallmark of sports psych mapping, beyond the questions and the topics, is the summary map. Sports psych mapping ends up and builds up to creating a summary map, a visual representation of our client's psychological reality. While you ask your questions, you take notes on a map of different concepts that go into three different areas: the external variables, the biopsychological descriptors, that means who our clients are and how they feel, and their psychological skills. And they color them in a color code from green to red. Green are very positive things, red are very negative things. You can even change the size of the concepts. That's when you work online, to represent relevance or importance or control or whatever you want to. But you walk out of that interview with a summary map. Now, that's important for several reasons, but one is we share that map with our clients. In my face-to-face sessions, I actually gave the original map to my clients. It's an A3 paper, it's quite big. I rolled it up, and I just handed it over to them and say, "You're going to take that home now. That's yours. I mean, you paid for the session. We run that session. You learned in that session. I have my notes. I took a picture of that map, but the map is yours." And from the feedback from my clients, first of all, they're very, very positive about taking something physical away from a psychological session. That's something they didn't expect. And they reacted very positively to that. And then I have, accounts of clients who hung up that map on their walls, in their dorms, in their rooms, in their sports clubs. They took pictures of it after that on their mobile phones. And it's become something very powerful for them to understand themselves as well and take that with them. It's not like an interview session where you learn and you forget. No, you learn, you take it away. And a lot of clients come back a couple of weeks later with that map, making notes, changing things, saying, "Hey, I didn't think about that. Well, I tested this in reality and I would change things," which at least helped my work a lot. In all open sessions, we presented a case. I will do that today as well because we want to showcase how flexible sports site mapping as a tool is and how and what contribution it can do, what contribution it won't do. So this is the map that I talked about. This is the visual representation of a session. Well, I blind date the interviewer and the interviewee. Let's call the interviewee Maria. Um, let's say she's a tennis player, and this sports psych mapping interview was done in an intake session. So the first time the sports psychologist actually met the athlete, they conducted a sports psych mapping session. The interview topic, which can change, sports psych mapping can be focused on different topics, but the most general topic is overall performance. So every question was asked about Maria's overall performance. Now this is the result of the map. Here you see different. We did void it a little bit. We cleaned it up, so there's only the most important aspects still on the map, just for making it easier to explain. But you can already see there are concepts within external variables, biopsychological descriptors, and psychological skills, and they follow a color code from red, which represents very problematic, to green, dark green, which represents something definitely helpful. So if we wanted to explain who Maria is based only on that summary map, imagine if I haven't been in that interview, I would say Maria is quite concerned about the dangerous facilities she trains at. Um, um, Training far away from her family home can be equally helpful as problematic. Her supportive parents are definitely helpful. Her demanding coach can be equally helpful as problematic. The tough training routine she sees as something rather helpful, but the few important games she's able to play based on where she is and the economic possibilities she has is something rather problematic. When we talked about herself, who she is and how she is in certain moments, something very problematic is her fear of injuries. Her high self-expectations can be equally helpful as problematic. Her low self-confidence is something rather problematic. Her uncontrollable anger is something she sees as very problematic. Her great desire to succeed is rather helpful. She considers herself the hardest worker in her club, in her training unit, which is definitely helpful. But she also experiences a bit of loneliness outside of sport, which is something rather problematic for her. Well, we talked about her psychological skills and also self-regulation strategies. Her great self-discipline is something definitely helpful. She also has a lot of control over nonverbal expressions, which is rather helpful. She has a lack of emotion control, which is very problematic. And regarding self-regulation strategies that are also examined in relation to psychological skills, she sometimes exaggerates pain while she's losing matches to protect her self-esteem, to say in some way. But she recognizes that is a rather problematic self-regulation strategy. Now, based on this first intake interview, we conducted follow-up interviews. So it was Maria herself who chose to conduct a second interview, an in-depth analysis of one specific topic that came up in the intake interview, and that was her uncontrollable anger. So her key aim with the sessions in sports psychology was to get control over her uncontrollable anger. And now every question in sports psych mapping was targeted at her uncontrollable anger. So the external variables were examined in relation to the uncontrollable anger. Her biopsychological descriptor, so who she is and how she feels, was examined in relation to uncontrollable anger, and her psychological skills were examined in relation to her uncontrollable anger. You will see that some of the concepts are the same than they were in the map before. The new ones, they're underlined. Um, but you see that the colors have changed. So now, in relation to uncontrollable anger, the tough competition in her sport in tennis is something rather problematic for Maria's anger. Her supportive parents, who before were generally definitely helpful, now are equally helpful as problematic in relation only to her anger. Her demanding coach now is very problematic in relation to her anger. The knockout competition format in tennis is very problematic in relation to her anger, and the few important games are very important in relation to her uncontrollable anger. Talking about herself, who she is and how she feels, she came up and she recognized her perfectionist personality, which is something rather problematic, as are her high self-expectations related to her anger. Her low self-confidence is something very problematic in relation to her anger. The great desire to succeed which before was rather helpful, now is equally helpful as problematic. She recognized some irrational beliefs like I have to win, which are definitely very problematic for her in relation to her anger. And she has negative thoughts and muscular tension, which both are rather problematic and related to her uncontrollable anger. Now, looking at her psychological skills and also self-regulation strategies related to her anger, well, she recognizes that she's giving herself the wrong self-messages when she's angry, which is rather problematic. The control of her nonverbal expressions is the only very definitely helpful thing in relation to her anger, because her lack of emotion control is something very problematic. And she also recognizes there's a lack of anticipation of anger situations. She can't anticipate when she gets angry, and that is very problematic for regulating her own anger. Now, based on this map, we also established hypotheses. So psych mapping, the summary map of psych mapping, helps sport and exercise psychologists, performance psychologists, sometimes also in collaboration with coaches, staff or athletes or performers to establish hypotheses. So the first hypothesis we established together with Maria is that her perfectionist personality leads her to have irrational beliefs, which then fuel her anger, and that anger is related to the negative thoughts and the muscular tension. Looking at external variables, we see that her supportive parents have contributed to her perfectionist personality, and her demanding coach is actually replicating or is reinforcing those irrational beliefs, saying the same things to Maria that Maria already believes or says to herself. And then the lack of anticipation of anger eliciting situation often leads to using the wrong self messages, because she already is angry when she starts to talk to herself. Those wrong self messages, on one hand, contain irrational or support irrational beliefs like I have to win, and on the other hand, of course, they don't contribute to better emotion control. And that lack of emotion control then contributes to that uncontrollable anger. Now, based on that, we could start proposing specific interventions which we could use with Maria. Now, it's very important, just as a side note, sport psych mapping alone isn't enough to diagnose or analyze or explore psychological realities. Often it has to be combined with other exploratory methods like observation, self-reports, objective measures, or even experimentation. In Maria's case, we decided two main interventions. I won't go into much depth of what we actually did or what the sports psychologist did, but we organized individual sessions either with Maria or Maria and her parents, and we conducted educational self-talk intervention sessions. And we use that map that we elaborated in following sessions to see what changes those interventions set off. So in monitoring sessions, what we did is, after a couple of weeks or month, we just gave the old map to Maria and asked her to introduce changes by hand writing on that map to the variables that she noticed, so that we can see if the interventions work and until when we have to continue using those interventions. So first of all, the educational self-talk intervention sessions led to metacognition, which led to the anticipation of anger eliciting situations. And by anticipating those situations, the self-messages got better adjusted. And by adjusting better self-messages, first of all, she was able to turn irrational thoughts like I have to win into more rational thoughts like I want to win, which then relate to more rational negative thoughts and to an understanding of muscular tension as a competitive tension. But better adjusted self-messages also led to better emotion control itself. The parent and player session, especially the ones combined with parents and players, Maria understood that her supportive parents weren't perfect themselves. So she had imperfect supportive parents, which then led her to accept better that she's a perfectionist and live better with her perfectionist personality. She also recognized in the individual sessions a new skill, which is the rationalization of coach behavior. And of course, by being able to rationalize better coach behavior, Maria was able to understand better her demanding coach. Now, all that together, for example, her perfectionist, understanding her perfectionist personality, turning irrational beliefs into more rational beliefs, understanding better her demanding coach, and improving her emotion regulation skills, all that contributed for her uncontrollable anger to turn into something that she called healthy, controllable anger. So we also conducted a follow-up session once the interventions were over, where we again repeated the same interview in relation to her previously uncontrollable anger, and now we can describe Maria in relation to her anger, and that the tough competition is something she sees helpful for her personal development. Her imperfect, supportive parents have become definitely helpful for accepting her anger. The demanding coach, well, is not perfect, but he can be equally helpful as problematic in relation to her personal development and her control of her anger. The knockout competition format is still something she struggles with even after the competition. But it turned from very problematic into something rather problematic. And the few important games, well, she's not very happy about not only being able to play a few important games, but sometimes they are still a problem in relation to her anger, and sometimes it's become something helpful. Her perfectionist personality, from being something really problematic or rather problematic, has turned into something that sometimes is even helpful. She turned her high self-expectations into realistic self-expectations, which is very helpful controlling her anger. Her confidence was previously low, it's now variable, sometimes high, sometimes low, and when it's high, it's helpful, when it's low, it's problematic. Her great desire to succeed equally is helpful and problematic. Her more rational thoughts, I want to win, are rather helpful, controlling her anger. Less negative thoughts, they're still problematic, but less problematic than they were before. And understanding her tension as competitive tension is something rather helpful in controlling and for her using her anger for her performance. Looking at psychological skills, effective self-messages are definitely helpful controlling her anger. Control of nonverbal expressions is rather helpful controlling her anger. It's not that necessary as it was before, because now she has some emotion control, which sometimes is helpful, sometimes it's still not helpful. Her adjusted anticipation of anger eliciting situations is helpful for the whole self-regulatory process, and rationalization of coach behavior is something definitely helpful for coping with a demanding coach, especially also in relation to her anger. So what you can see here, just as the end message of this example case that I presented, here you have the four maps. The first map on the top left corner was the intake session, where you can easily identify four red spots which a sports psychologist could target in their intervention: the dangerous facilities, fear of injuries, the uncontrollable anger, and the lack of emotion control. The later two were the ones that we actually targeted because of the demands of the athlete. Then you can see on the top right corner an in-depth analysis of uncontrollable anger. So we use sports psych mapping once to analyze overall performance and then to analyze a specific concept. Of course, this map is much more red because we're looking at a problematic situation, but you don't only have to look at problematic situations. Sometimes we conduct in-depth analysis of something that's very helpful, something very positive, because we aim to maintain that positive thing. Here you can see a lot of red in that uncontrollable anger map. On the bottom left corner, you can see, well, on the bottom right corner, you can see the map of hypothesized relations, no, the map of the monitoring sessions, how things changed over the sessions. And then the bottom left corner, you can see the replication of the uncontrollable anger in-depth analysis interview, and you can see how it changed from red to green, reinforcing the interventions, of course, but also showing the athlete how they have developed in relation to a specific topic, which encouraged, in this case, Maria to continue working. And as far as I know, they continued working on the fear of injuries. They also conducted a new overall performance analysis map, and new problems arose because that's the nature of humans in and outside of performance. So I hope that this case example helped you understand how sports psych mapping is helpful, what it can contribute to our professional practice. So here's a summary of some of the advantages sports psych mapping has, at least giving us, me and Edu, and the people we collaborate with, and also past students that we already talked with in their applied practice. So first of all, it's directly applicable. So once you've done the course, the 2-day course we offer at the University of Suffolk, it's usually Saturday and Sunday. On a Monday, you can meet with an athlete and conduct sports psych mapping interviews, although you will, of course, improve and automatize and adapt these procedures to your personal style and improve your application over time. You can use sports psych mapping in diverse sessions. You can use it in intake sessions to make a very global analysis. We use it in screening sessions where we work in large academies or federations where we meet with athletes regularly every 4, 5, 6 months, just to get an idea how they are. Instead of having an unstructured session, we conduct sports psych mapping sessions in which we can identify topics we could work on in individualized sessions later on. And we also create maps that we can compare over time and see the development of athletes in those large environments. We conduct follow-up or in-depth analysis sessions that you've seen, like the one on uncontrollable anger. We also use sports psych mapping in teaching. So we propose for coaches, for athletes, sports psychologists at the university topic, and they come up and analyze the variables related to the external variable, to the external world, to the environment, to the athletes or to the people in themselves and their psychological skills. So it can be used for teaching purposes. We also use it for research purposes in our research case studies. Sports psych mapping is also very positive because you can use it with different people or different agents. You can use it with athletes, coaches, parents, referees, and so on. But you can also use it outside of sports. We have a large project with over 200 researchers, a large company in the UK. We also worked individually with programmers, musicians, artists, different types of performers, and PhD students. And sports psych mapping applies outside of sport just as it does in sport. You can work individually with athletes, coaches, parents, or non-sport performers, or you can work with teams. So it means people or couples of 2 people, or larger teams. We have used sports psych mapping, for example, to analyze football and basketball teams. Usually we split teams into groups of 6 athletes, or 5 athletes and a coach. And then we organize sessions with those. Of course, we don't analyze individual aspects with sports psych mapping in team sessions. We analyze the team as one. You can use it also with clubs and organizations. For example, we used it with several clubs to analyze their own philosophy, who they are, who they want to be, who they want their athletes to be, what environment their athletes need, what psychological skills they want to develop with their athletes. And it helped us a lot to establish goals for the next 2, 3 years in the development of those clubs and organizations. And as I said, we also used it with students. You can explore different topics from general well-being and performance, like you've seen in the intake interview with Maria, to specific issues, like in Maria's case was the uncontrollable anger. We also analyzed past and future events. So if somebody had just a very important event that went very well or went very badly, and you want to analyze it, sports psych mapping applies to that. You can conduct an in-depth analysis of a specific event. What was the external or the environment in that event? Who were the athletes in that event, and what psychological skills did they use or not use in that event? And the same thing goes for future events. So we used some of the athletes, for example, in preparation of the Olympic Games. And you can use it even further for career planning. So we used it a lot for dual career support, career planning of coaches, and career development of both athletes, coaches, and non-sport performers. It looks like sports psych mapping can be used mainly for personal issues, so intrapersonal issues like the uncontrollable anger of Maria, but we also used it a lot in social and interpersonal issues such as conflict, team cohesion, team goals, and so on and so forth. Although you can use sports psych mapping the way we designed it, the way it is published, you will blend it with your professional style in time. So you can decide if you want to work more practitioner or more client-centered or more task-centered. But basically what a lot of times my personal experience is, you start more practitioner-centered, so you tell people how to conduct that task. But with repeated sessions, you hand over control to your clients. At one point, I give my clients the question cards, I give them the summary map, I give them the pens, and I just sit back and they conduct the interview themselves without me interfering. I'm just there to give them feedback at the end. You can use it in face-to-face sessions, which we all prefer, well, at least I prefer, but the pandemic has forced us successfully to also prepare an online version of sports psych mapping that we share in our online CPD, of course, and This is the version we use in the online CPD for our practice. You can also use it as homework. So once you've gone from this practitioner-centered or practitioner-controlled to client-controlled application in your sessions, a lot of times what I do is I give the cards and the map to my athletes to take them home to analyze by themselves a specific topic, come to the next session, and they come in with the map prepared and we can discuss the map. So you can also use it as a homework. You can use it more structured or semi-structured way. Your feedback can go from interrogative to directive feedback. And of course, you can blend parts of sports psych mapping with personal interview guides you already have developed on your personal styles, or even with other interview guides that are out there in the literature. As also another advantage of sports psych mapping, it causes some collateral positive effects besides exploring people's psychological reality. We have seen that the repeated application of sports psych mapping enhances our client's self-awareness. A lot of times the questions asked, they're not regular questions our clients are asked in their everyday life. So reflecting on different topics creates self-awareness, and representing their own views of their psychological reality visually on a paper helps them then to improve that representation. A lot of times my athletes take the maps home and come back a week later and say, I forgot here, I forgot there, this I didn't evaluate the right way. And all those corrections indicate an increased metacognition or self-awareness. When you use sports psych mapping in team settings, both coaches and athletes has told us it is a quite strong team building activity because you discuss important issues around the team, who the team is, what skills the team has or needs to develop, what's the environment of the team that explains some of its reactions. And that apparently there's also reason from the literature to support that is a team building activity. We used it for teaching psychology in formal settings in the university, in coach development courses and programs, but also it teaches psychology to athletes or to our clients, because if you use a bit more of a directive feedback and you introduce topics that you think are important, or you modify the language they use to make it not academic but a bit more precise, that teaches them aspects of psychology which can come in handy for their own self-regulation. You can compare sports psych maps over time. As I said, we have some of our athletes have conducted 4 or 5 general performance interviews already, and you can see how important aspects change over time. Also, not only they change in evaluation, but what is important for an athlete when they're aged 16, 17 isn't the same than what is important when they're aged 20, 21, 22. And it facilitates information exchange. Until now, if one professional conducted exploratory interviews with their client, I mean, you could take notes, you could record that interview, you could transcribe it if you were very accurate. But it's very, very difficult that if that athlete left working with you, or you left a facility or club and someone else took over working with that athlete, that they would actually go back to your notes. Even if there's ethic, of course, there has to be an ethical permission. There has to be an agreement with the athlete in terms of confidentiality. But it's very difficult that you would go back to someone else's notes and try and interpret what happened in that interview. But now, what we found out that I can give a colleague a map, and they can read that map relatively easily and recognize important aspects. Of course, there are nuances they're going to miss because they haven't been in the interview, but there's a simple visual representation of what has been done before, and that facilitates information exchange. So to finish, I just wanted to give you a short overview of what our Introduction to Sports Psych Mapping course is about. It's a 2-day course. We usually offer it on a Saturday and Sunday. It is online, and what we offer is a 3rd day, a tutorial meeting. So after a couple of weeks of using sports psych mapping, you meet with one of the tutors. So that's usually me or Edu, maybe in the future someone else, and you can discuss your personal experience, your questions, your comments in an individual session a couple of weeks after the course has taken place. We offered it in English and Spanish in April 2021. We have our next English edition in July 2021. We have our next Spanish edition. And once we finish our editions, we look if we're going to organize more editions in the future. In terms of topics, there's a bit of theory to understand the knowledge map, which is the theoretical basis of sports psych mapping, but we rather explain how to use sports psych mapping, and by applying sports psych mapping in practice, you will get acquainted with the theory. It's the other way around, from practice to theory more than from theory to practice. There are right now up to 6 hours of practice in our sport psych mapping course, where you will role play being the sport exercise psychologist, but also being the performer. And very importantly, there's also a couple of hours dedicated to interpreting and analyzing psych maps, so the summary maps of sport psych mapping. We have some quizzes. They're not there to grade people, just for you to keep track of your learning. There are networking opportunities. Our general aims is, of course, for you to learn to apply sports psych mapping. And because sports psych mapping isn't a set of fixed procedure, but just a couple of suggestions, by using it in your own way, you will help developing sports psych mapping and hopefully become part of the sports psych mapping community. So as I said, this is the next editions that we will run. April 17th, 18th is the next English edition, and in July 24th, 25th is the next Spanish edition. You can sign up through our webpage at the University of Suffolk. So every open session ended with a Q&A. Of course, this is a recording, so there's no Q&A, but please feel free to get in touch with me, Alexander Latignac at the University of Suffolk, if you have any questions. We also have a Twitter page called Psych Mapping. I have a personal Twitter page under my name. And we have an Instagram page, which we just started in April 2021, so we are not that many followers yet, but you can find us there. It's also called Psych Mapping. There's also Psych Mapping YouTube page where you can find videos like this one. I hope this recording has been helpful. I really hope that we meet one day and discuss in person about sports psych mapping, either in conferences, informal meetings, or maybe in one of our Introduction to Sports Psych Mapping CPD courses.